Welcome back to the Community Review on Hot 92.3. I'm Josefa Salinas, your host. Well, today is definitely a day of reflection. A lot of people are going to be thinking about where they were on September 11th, 10 years ago. It doesn't even seem possible that many years have passed, but we all were somewhere doing something. And on a day like this, a 10-year anniversary of September 11th, we do a lot of reflection. On the phone with us, we have a very, very interesting author and filmmaker who's taking a controversial and critical look at the fallout from American reaction to 9/11. It's called I Am an American. On the phone with us, Cynthia Weber. Good morning.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fabulous, Cynthia. Let's talk a little bit about the I Am American. This is a documentary?
It's a documentary and a book, that's right, yes. And basically, when people hear "I am an American," they probably think of the public service announcement that came out just after September 11 called "I am an American." Do you remember that?
Yes, I do remember that. Mm-hmm.
Yes, so that was really the inspiration for the project. I happened to be in the United States shortly after September 11 because I live in England, and I was back in the States and I saw that public service announcement. And for people who don't remember it, it's a bunch of folks just of different races, religions, ages, ethnicities, looking directly into the camera and saying, "I am an American." And it was a very moving ad. It was about sort of celebrating the melting pot ideal in the United States, where it's this idea that, all our individual differences of race, religion, melt away because we identify as U.S. citizens. And it was celebrating this idea that we're a tolerant people and a tolerant nation. And indeed, it even ends with the U.S. motto, E pluribus unum, and because we don't study Latin very much, I didn't study Latin very much, it's translated for us to out of many, one. And the makers of the ad said that was to convey the idea that out of many different kinds of U.S. citizens, we're one unified nation. And I remember watching it and being very moved by it, but I was also worried that it was protesting a little bit too much, kind of reminding us how tolerant we are as a nation and a people, so that we wouldn't be intolerant in the wake of September 11. And indeed, the makers of the ad said that that's exactly what they were trying to convey and trying to avert was a backlash against different, people who are perceived to be different after September 11. So as I was watching, I was thinking to myself, I wonder who these U.S. citizens are going to be who are not seen to be part of that one unified nation. And what my project is about, what the documentary does, is a series of vignettes about U.S. citizens, some of whom were seen to be part of the one, were seen to be melted into the U.S. melting pot, but the vast majority of them are stories about what I would call unmeltable Americans. These are U.S. citizens whose differences were seen to be undesirable or even threatening after September 11, and how, in their cases, they didn't end up enjoying the full rights and freedoms that we usually associate with U.S. citizenship.
Now, you live in Europe now. And I've traveled all over the world, and I always tell people, you have no idea how we're perceived in other countries.
Yeah.
And they think, well, what do you mean? Why wouldn't they think Americans are great? And I'm like, oh my gosh, that great is not a word that's generally after the word American in other countries.
Well, it depends. I mean, certainly living in England, when you start to speak with an American accent, you automatically lose 10 IQ points because people think you're not as smart.
Right.
But at the same time, we're seen to be, more, genuine, affectionate, interesting, forward-thinking. But kind of overriding experience I have is that the way I'm perceived very often depends on who the president of the United States is at the time. So
wow.
What people do is, whether they mean to or not, if during the Bush administration, there were a lot of people in Europe who were very unhappy with the Bush administration. Many more of them were unhappy with me because I'm a U.S. citizen, and that was particularly the case when President Bush was reelected. They just didn't understand what that was about. But when President Obama was elected, I was suddenly incredibly popular, and I hadn't done anything different. So it's just that equation of a citizen with their state is something that it happens to people of all countries all over the world, but it really has a resonance when you're a U.S. citizen, because U.S. foreign policy is something that's felt by people around the world.
Now, when you were filming your documentary and writing this book, tell me some of the differences that you found in people's idea of what being an American is.
Yeah, well, it was really interesting. What I did was I went around and I interviewed people who, had a sense that Americanness was something that was never changing and, had been that way from the founding of the nation, through to people who had an understanding that what it means to be a U.S. American is something that changes, as we live it. And so, for example, in the first category, one of the people I interviewed was Chris Simcox, who is the founder of the Minutemen Civil Defense Corps. And his idea of Americanness was, defending the traditional values of the United States and defending the borders of the United States. And his idea was, when I spoke with him, it was as if, this notion of Americanness was something that was unchanging, that it hadn't changed since 1776, and it was his kind of duty and the duty of the Minutemen to make sure it didn't change. And so, I'm sure your listeners in the Los Angeles area are familiar with, some of the Minutemen ideas about, keeping out undocumented immigrants and not having any amnesty for undocumented peoples in the United States. And so there's that kind of sense of, not only does what it means to be a U.S. citizen not change, but we're not going to change who's allowed to be a U.S. citizen or not. So, and when I asked him what it meant to be an American, he said, vigilance, eternal vigilance. That's what it means to be an American. So that was a very, an answer that was very much lived through his, filtered through his experience of what he was doing, what he thought his patriotic mission was in the wake of September 11. On the other hand, I interviewed somebody else, a woman named Julia Shearson, whose family came over on the Mayflower, and whose family had fought in every war in the United States throughout the history of the United States. But she had a much more malleable sense of what it meant to be an American. Her sense of what it meant to be an American was somebody who got the balance between security and justice right. And her experience was that the reason I ended up interviewing her was that she had taken a journey to just did a little picnic over in Canada with her daughter one day. They live in northern Ohio, so this was an easy trip to make. And when they were coming back through customs, when Julia handed over her passport and her daughter's passport, the computer in the agent's booth started saying armed and dangerous. And Julia was taken out of her car. She was handcuffed. She was paraded across like 18 lanes of traffic and detained and questioned for some time before she was finally let go because she was neither armed nor dangerous. But the reason why she believes that she was detained is because she had converted to Islam. And she had heard the call to convert to Islam before September 11, and she told me, when September 11 happened, she thought to herself, oh no, now I can't become a Muslim, because she feared that there was going to be a backlash. But her religious beliefs were such that she had to go ahead and, that was important to her to do that. But that's not a reason to be, detained. And what she found out was that she was put on a terrorist watch list, and she's been suing the U.S. government under the Privacy Act to try to get removed from that watch list. And that's ongoing. I mean, one of the things that when I interviewed Julia, President Obama had just been elected, and I said, are your experiences different now under the Obama administration than they were under the Bush administration? And her reply to me was, Obama is president and I'm still on the watch list. So, and she also said, but, the way she kind of summed up her experience was, Patrick Henry didn't say, give me security or give me death. He said, give me liberty. And so again, it's her sense of what it means to be an American is someone who gets that balance between liberty and security right, because the U.S. experiment is supposed to be about the exercise of liberty.
Wow. Well, I have to say I can identify with her. After 9/11, I was put on a watch list. And I have no idea why. And I would, anytime I would fly, I would have to pull out all kinds of ID. They would take me somewhere else, and, I get the pat down and everything. And they would look at my kids, ask them questions. And I asked Lena, I said, why are you doing this? She said, because you're on a watch list. I said, for what? And she goes, you need to contact the FBI for that.
Yeah,
I said,
well,
what?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the way Julia describes being on the watch list, she says it's like Hotel California. You can get on the list, but you can never get off the
Right,
list.
You can't get off. They don't bother me so much anymore. I don't know. I guess they figured maybe somehow I got on accidentally, or that after watching me for a while that I wasn't worth watching. I'm not quite sure. But I don't travel with as many problems now as I used to. But I mean, I was put there, and Islam is not a religion that I practice. So
Yeah.
it was very interesting, the criteria that they used for just placing people, you know, as a whim, just on watch lists. It was very interesting.
One of the interesting things about the aftermath of September 11 is that when we think about the backlash against U.S. citizens, I mean, not to mention all the sorts of things that have happened internationally, but staying within a U.S. context, you know, we do think about how Muslim Americans and Arab Americans and Sikh Americans who were mistaken for Muslim or Arab were subjected to these kinds of backlashes. And one of the things that I found is that it hasn't just stopped with that. It's this kind of sense where, you know, I was talking earlier about this notion of unmeltable Americans, U.S. citizens who were seen to be undesirable or even threatening to the U.S. state. Well, that's changed. Who they are. I mean, it's not that Muslims, Arabs, and Sikh Americans aren't still targeted for these kinds of practices, but, you know, it's now become other categories of U.S. citizens as well. You know, human rights activists, animal rights and environmentalists, artists and academics. And so, you know, these lists get longer, and the people who are subjected or who are considered to be with or you know, supporting the terrorists or being terrorists, it's broadened beyond anything I think anyone ever imagined. Now, of course, it shouldn't be historically surprising, because the way that the term terrorist has been used in the aftermath of September 11 is not unlike the way the term communist was used during the Cold War. But it doesn't make it right.
So how do we as citizens look at our country and realize that there's a lot of people like me who are swept up into these very broad terms, because so many bills and pieces of legislation and laws were passed so quickly after September 11th, and I think
repassed,
yes,
not so long ago.
Yes, and I think that first people were all like gung-ho, yes, whatever you need to do to protect us, and now people are going, well, wait a minute, that's a little too broad.
Yeah.
So how do we look at that now?
Well, I mean, you know, the question is, what do we do? I mean, one of the conundrums that we face, you know, is that whenever one of the things that we happen, and one of the things that you're talking about, is that when the United States feels threatened, usually the executive branch tries to have more power in relation to the legislative and the judicial branches. And one of the things we saw under the Bush administration was how the executive branch took a lot of power away from the judiciary. So, for example, when we think about Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and how the people who are, you know, all the prisoners there, all of whom are Muslim, are not allowed to go through the sort of hadn't been going through the same legal channels for trials as, you know, the Geneva Convention wasn't honored, and they weren't allowed to go through the U.S. trials. Those sorts of things. I mean, you know, that those kinds of practices have been occurring, and the difficulty, the sad thing is that even when administrations change, the executive branch of government still tries to retain all of that power. So President Obama didn't give that power back to the judiciary. That's just not what happens. I mean, I know Hillary Clinton campaigned with a bit of a promise to give some of those powers back, but you know, who knows whether that would have happened or not. I'm a bit skeptical. So, you know, one of the things that we have to try to think about how the checks and balances of government can work, and what it is that we could possibly do to get those checks and balances back in some kind of balance. And if we're concerned about how security and justice are out of balance, I mean, that's one of the reasons why, and so that's something that we need to do to try to address that. Do I have any idea about how we would go about that? I don't know, but it's something that we need to solve as a nation. The other thing I think we need to think about, I think one of the lessons of of what occurs in the wake of a national crisis in the United States, not just in the past, not just in relation to September 11, but in any historical period, is that whenever fear and patriotism combine to make some people, some U.S. citizens, seen to be undesirable or threatening, our tolerance goes out the window. And you know, one of the things that that people in the United States celebrate about themselves, indeed what the I Am an American Public Service announcement celebrated about U.S. citizens and the U.S. nation, is how we're a tolerant people and a tolerant nation. And that's fine, except the problem is that tolerance isn't a high enough standard to hold ourselves to. And the reason is because tolerance so quickly becomes intolerance. I mean, they're like two sides of the same coin. And which side that coin is going to land on depends on how fear and patriotism align themselves. So I think one of the other things that we need to do is really hold ourselves to a higher standard than just saying, you know, tolerance. Because if I say, you know, I tolerate you, what I've done is I've put myself in a position to be able to judge you. I've already put myself in a morally superior position to you, and so say, I tolerate you, and it's kind of like saying, well, I tolerate you even though you're inferior to me. And of course, by saying that, I reserve the right for myself to stop tolerating you at any time. So what we need to do is move to a position where people, you know, in the United States and certainly outside of the United States as well, are treated with, you know, justice and equality, not based on some kind of hierarchical standard or some hidden hierarchical standard that we have within this notion of tolerance, but it just has to be something that's, you know, across the board.
Most definitely. Well, the book and the documentary are called I Am an American.
Filming the fear of difference.
The fear of difference. And sometimes that really does make people become afraid when someone isn't fitting into what they call normal and what they call regular for their particular road in life. And that difference sometimes makes us draw back even with other Americans.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, and what we have to remember is that, you know, as I was saying earlier, this notion of Americanness isn't something that's set in stone. It's not something that we just invented in 1776 and it's been unchanging. I mean, certainly there are values and principles as a nation that we want to hold ourselves accountable to. But who we are as a people and who we are as a nation is dependent upon how we act as a people and how we act as a nation. I mean, what it means to be an American is about what U.S. citizens do, what U.S. society does, what U.S. government does. And so, you know, this, I think, is why it's important to remember September 11 and remember what happened in the aftermath of September 11, because it's all of that history that influences who we'll become as a nation and a people.
Well, I tell you, it's an amazing, amazing journey, and thank you so much for taking it with us, both in a book form and a documentary form, Cynthia. Is there a website where people can go for more information?
Yeah, actually, all of the vignettes from the film are available on my website called IamAnAmericanProject.com, and the links to the book are also on that website.
Very good. Well, I'll make sure that this link stays up on my webpage at hot923.com. Keyword Josefa. The website again, IamAnAmericanProject.com. Cynthia Weber, thank you for tackling this sensitive subject on a day when it's time for maybe all of us to look back, reflect a little bit, and see what we can do to be better Americans.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks a lot for that.
Thank you.
All right.
A reflective day, 10 years post 9/11. There's more on the way on the Community Review, Hot 92.3.